Um, Hi, good afternoon. I'm Andrew. Preferred pronouns are he, him. I'm a PhD candidate at McMaster University in the School of Labor Studies. I'm just getting my own timer going here. And so, yes, my project is looking into labor process theory and applying it to educational labor educational labor spaces, and specifically comparing teachers with different labor contracts in that same space. Recently, I've added on the during COVID-19 part that obviously wasn't there at the start of my project. Okay, so why labor process theory? It's an effective theoretical tool for comparing and discussing feelings of workers with different labor contracts doing the same thing or similar thing, because it might not be the exact same if you're a permanent teacher or you're a part-time teacher. And so in Ontario public education, teachers with occasional or precarious contracts will probably feel different about doing the same or similar job than their permanent contract colleagues. And the debates in educational LPT have mirrored, I guess you could say, the larger LPT debates in regards to there's been criticisms towards LPT that it doesn't take in the subjective experience of the person. So some people have argued for more of a maybe a Foucauldian lens argument. A lot of people in this, I guess, a lot of theorists who have been writing about this have now said that that's kind of a false dichotomy and that we can talk about these subjective aspects through a labor process lens. And that's kind of what my project's wanting to do, is look at the larger political economy and then look at the subjective impacts on the workers with different labor contracts in that labor space. So what does educational labor look like in Ontario? What do different labor contracts look like? So I've adapted from previous researchers, Paul Chaliakakis and Meinzak, this labor pyramid here. And as you can see, there's a similarity to a segmented labor market or a dual labor market. I'll first talk about the pyramid here. And at the top of the pyramid is the full-time permanent contract teacher. And that person in secondary school, that should highlight that I'm dealing with high schools, so with the secondary educators. The full-time permanent contract teacher would be teaching 3 lines or 3 courses in one semester. And if there's 2 semesters in a school year, they'd be teaching 6 courses for the school year. Below them, there would be teachers with a permanent contract. So they're guaranteed courses every semester, but they might not have 3 full lines. They might have 1 line or they might have 2 lines. And then those would be the secure employees. Below them a bit further, there would be long-term occasional teachers, known as LTOs. So I might refer to them throughout this as LTOs. And those would be teachers who, they'd be very similar to the permanent. They could be teaching for an entire school year. They could be teaching for an entire semester, 3 full lines, and their work would be nearly identical to a permanent contract employee. There would also be LTO workers who say might do a 1-month LTO and then supply teach day to day the rest of the year, kind of. Not necessarily by choice, because that was available to them. Moving a little down from that, there would be short-term occasional, and the short-term occasional is less than 10 days. So a long-term occasional is anything more than 10 days, and the short-term is less than 10 days. Below that would be day-to-day supply teaching. And we can even fracture that further in regards to, there'd be day-to-day supply teachers that would have guaranteed jobs, maybe even a month in advance at the same school or at say 2 or 3 different schools. And then there might be day-to-day supply teachers who don't know where they're going at every given day. They're waiting till maybe up to 11 o'clock at night for a phone call, or as early as 5 in the morning for a phone call to know what they're doing on that given day. And so there are similarities to the dual labor market analysis here. However, I'd like to point out a key difference that I'd like to thank one of my colleagues for pointing this out to me, that there's a mention of the high work autonomy in regards in this chart here. And there's a lot of debate within educational labor process theory to the degree to which teachers have full autonomy. There's a lot of questioning that they have very limited autonomy. And I would probably side with that argument, that, and that's why the LPT lens is a very useful lens, because it starts discussing this lack of autonomy. So what does this look like numerically if we were to like move this into a graph? So numerically, we can see that the LTOs have been growing for the past few years. And we can see that the full-time equivalent teachers, so these would be teachers with permanent contracts, they've been decreasing as well. Important to note that the LTOs here, this doesn't include those daily teachers that I was talking about, the OT teachers or the STO teachers. So there are teachers that are even being left out of this data here, which is another huge issue when studying, I found, educational labor in Ontario, is the data is difficult to come by because of lack of it, different use of terminology, and etc. All right. So how can we learn more about these differences in labor contracts? What questions might be good tools to help explore these differences? So from a personal level, for an individual level, I should say, when comparing occasional and permanent contract teachers, how do feelings towards their labor processes and professional effectiveness differ? The professional effectiveness is a key thing because in teaching, there's a thing called standards of practice, and it's put out by our college, the professional college, and teachers are expected to kind of adhere to that. And I'm really curious the differences that, say, someone with a precarious contract and someone with a permanent contract, how they would feel maybe in their ability to maybe meet those standards. And I'll discuss that in a little bit. And how does their own personal wellness and the impacts on their home life differ? Importantly, moving in, how do they feel towards other teachers or other groups within their labor space, such as their union, the management, and how do they also feel towards socialist policies? Like, there's some people that talk when they there's some researchers who, when discussing precarious workers, talk about the negative psychological and emotional impacts it can have in regards to freezing you and not enabling you to think longer term. So you're just stuck kind of thinking in the moment. So what are the impacts of that if that's an education worker who it's beneficial for them to think maybe in a bigger picture frame of mind? And lately, this last question has been added on, but I actually think it might be one of the most fruitful questions. How have things changed since the start of COVID-19? All right, so why am I doing this research? I myself am a teacher. I'm interested in critical pedagogy. I'm interested in spaces that enable critical pedagogy. And I'm a precarious worker, so I would like to study more on it. And there's also research that is asking for more of this research. So more interested into what labor spaces enable progressive forms of education, what labor spaces enable a healthy educator. Labor process theory is also asking for more examples of different educational spaces from different sectors, even if it's higher ed or even K to 12. And precarious work. How is precarious work maybe now moving into previously professional sectors? So all these different discourses are looking for more research and more data into this. So data collection. First, the main interest is the quantitative aspect. Have the LTOs been increasing? Has this segmentation been increasing, or is this a norm? Has this been around the whole time? I'm really curious to see if this was if the rates that we see now, if they were similar pre-Mike Harris, the pre-Mike Harris cuts, and what the ratio or like what the average percentage of an LTO worker was pre-Harris. Were there 10% of the workforce was LTO pre-Harris? Was it 5%? Because we're going to now see that it's creeping up a little bit higher than that. And then, so after I get the numerical data, the subjective is very important. So through an online survey, I'm going to take participants, ideally have 1 to 2 dozen teachers, all with those different labor contracts, so I can then kind of compare how they feel towards questions geared towards the labor process. How do they feel towards issues of surveillance, work intensification, their own flexibility, and the flexibility of others. Okay, so in an effort to start my search for the quantitative data, I've looked to different school boards, first of all, because I figured that the larger provincial data could be different if we look at a school board by region, and they do differ, but there's also similarities as well here. So this is the Hamilton School Board here, Thames Valley. This is London, Ontario, and Halton. This would be like Burlington and Oakville, and we can see that these numbers have gone up, gone down slightly, but they're in the same range in regards to what the provincial data was, in between, say, the 10 to 20% range. And I'm curious as to if these are same throughout other school boards in Ontario. So in looking for this research, something actually came to light, and that was the difference between boards in regards to their privacy policies. So moving to the next slide here. So most of the school boards, if you're to interview their workers, they require you to get permission if you're doing the interviews on site. Doesn't say anything about offsite. The Hamilton board doesn't allow their workers to, or cautions their workers about being interviewed offsite. And this brings in the importance of zubas analysis on the impacts that, say, technology and perceptions of kind of being surveyed and watched might have on a worker and how they feel towards their own work environment. So these are all factors that have kind of been influencing how I think I'm going to get my data, how my interviews are going to turn out, and who's going to do these surveys. So for the first survey, I'm going to hopefully get a nice mix of a variety of people. However, a recent article, Bias-Free Hiring by Bawia and Izadrab, I hope I'm pronouncing the names correctly, my apologies if I'm not. They've said that, yeah, teaching in Ontario is largely white and middle class. And so I hopefully will get outside of that demographic, but I'm thinking I probably will get a bunch white middle class respondents. In regards to the qualitative interviews, as I said, I want to see how the teachers feel about meeting the professional standards put out by their college. Because I'm thinking, like, one of the key aspects is a learning community. How do people with different contracts communicate in their learning community? Are the impacts in their home life similar to what's already been revealed in the works of Clark, Luchuk, and DeWolf in regards to it not being very sustainable? It's very detrimental to personal health. And what are the impacts if this type of labor is being commodified, lack of personal wellness is happening, and they're standing in front of young people? So education is supposed to be a fundamental human right. What problems arise when the labor in that space is being commodified? So last two slides here. So what are my predictions from all this data, from my data and my research is there's going to be some increase in segmentation, as we can already see. The degree is something I'm curious about. Again, the pre-Harris and the post-Harris, that's my key interest. COVID's probably going to be weakening morale. I'm in a school right now. I can say it definitely is weakening morale. A divided labor union, problematic for collective action, problematic for this historic time and the central role that public education can play towards a greater democracy and model for future workplace labor conditions, which are doable and needed now. And that brings me into my last slide here for policy proposals. So we hear calls for a Green New Deal and a just recovery because of the COVID crisis. And I'm reminded back to early at the start of COVID, an article by Arundhati Roy, the pandemic is a porthole, and all the changes that, say, progressive groups or people supporting socialist policies can maybe really advocate for now. And I see that as a possibility. And there's arguments for it too economically. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives put out a crisis. Bank of Canada, an article talking about what the Bank of Canada Act can do to help fund these public sectors to help create a just recovery. Unfortunately, the Ontario government released its budget recently, and there was not a lot of education, or little education spending into it. So the arguments for more money into education to help maybe not have precarious workers, like why are there precarious workers in education to begin with, even at the higher education level? Maybe it's problematic for learning spaces. The arguments for increased funding are there. The problem is I guess forces in power might not be listening or ideologically aligned with those views. And I'd like to thank you everyone for your time. My first conference presentation.